Thank you, Munir, and thank you very much for the opportunity to talk. I'm really sorry I'm not Camilla. She would have done this much better than me, and I'm right at the last moment. I did actually make a lot of Camilla's slides, but she shared them, she borrowed them, but it was Camilla who put them all together, so I'm going to try and put them together as best I can. The first thing I'm going to do is deviate from the order and go straight down to... you've got a sneak preview of what it all looks like. No, missed it. Sorry, bear with me one moment. The key slide that I wanted in here is not in here, so never mind. Let's not worry about it. God, it started so well. Okay. So the IVD directive is what we're currently working at the moment. It means that you've got to have a CE mark on your device before it can be made available. And the CE mark means it meets a number of basic requirements around safety and performance. For some higher risk IVDs, they need to be looked at by a notified body. Any notified bodies in the room? We've got Brian from UL. There are other notified bodies available. Notified bodies are designated and monitored in the UK by MHRA. We work with other competent authorities and with the European Commission and auditors to make sure that they work to a very high standard, and that's consistent across the EU. So one of the basic differences between a medicine and a medical device is the marketing authorization comes from the competent authority for a medicine, MHRA in the UK, or for a medical device, for a diagnostic device, the marketing authorization comes from the notified body, the independent third-party certification body, which is designated and monitored by the competent authority. So it's one step removed. And that's a really important difference as we kind of talk about the regulations. Having said that, all the regulations are changing completely. We're keeping the notified bodies, absolutely, and we're strengthening their position. We're making sure that they are much more consistent, that their standards are higher, that we are working more closely with them. For diagnostic devices, at the moment under the IVD directive, around about 80% of diagnostic devices are self-certified. The manufacturer places them on the market without a notified body. So they're considered low risk. There's another 20% which are around protection of the blood supply, so HIV, hepatitis, which are considered high risk, where the notified bodies get more directly involved and they will give their certificate to the manufacturer before they're placed on the market. And we have some new regulations, and you can see here on the little diagram, in May 2017 they were published, so they came into law for medical device regulations and for IVD regulations. Medical devices, the changes are not so fundamental as a 3-year transition. So in May 2020, any medical device being made available in the UK must meet the requirements of the new regulations. In May 2022, any IVD being made available in the UK must, or in a member state of the EU, must meet the requirements of the new regulations. In the new regulations, 95% of diagnostic devices will be looked at by a notified body. So we're going from 20% to 95%, a very big change in pre-market scrutiny by an independent certification body. So at the moment there's just 1 or 2 genetic tests which are covered by these notified bodies in the directive. In the new regulations, human genetic tests will have their own category. They will also be within the second highest risk classification, so they will have quite a lot of scrutiny before they're placed on the market or made available in the UK. The question earlier on from Nanette was around sending your samples away outside of the EU, and if that information comes back to a patient or to a clinician in the UK, we will also, these new regulations will also cover that product in that country. So we will be trying to extend the regulation outside of the boundaries of the EU, outside this geographical distribution. There'll be requirements for clinical evidence, and I think that's the bulk of Camilla's talk, is talking about how much more additional clinical evidence is needed before it can be made available with a CE mark. There are requirements for companion diagnostics. Companion diagnostics are those diagnostics which are essential for the safe and effective use of a corresponding medicinal product. So if you have a medicine which is perhaps targeted, works with a gene target, then only those people with that gene target will benefit from that medicine, or will be at risk from that medicine, depending on which way it goes. The test which looks for that gene target will be a companion diagnostic. It'll be a much higher level of scrutiny, which will include scrutiny by the notified body and by the Medicines Authority. Then that last bullet point, the health institution exemption, I'm going to talk about that in more depth this afternoon and give you a reason why. The rationale about how, if you're a health institution, you can make or modify a device and use it on your own patients or in your own health institution without necessarily having to go through all of the same regulatory hurdles, hoops. There's a different route map for getting products into clinical use. Okay, so Camilla's talk focuses on that second bullet point, which is clinical evidence, the clinical evidence requirements. This is definitely for any new products which are being made available under the new regulations between now and 2022, and any products being made available after 2022, which must comply with the regulations. So clinical evidence is what is the evidence to get this product available for use, to get a CE mark on it, or to be able to apply the health institution exemption. And we're expecting, under the new regulations, that clinical evidence will be based on performance studies, on actual samples and actual patients. So that they'll be work done in the lab, they'll be work done in the clinic to get the evidence to support the claims for the intended purpose of the device, of the diagnostic device. You need that to show to the notified body. The manufacturer will need that to show to the notified body to say to the notified body, we have sufficient clinical evidence to warrant getting a CE mark on this product. And not just at that point to get the product into use, to get the CE mark, but also throughout the life cycle of the product. So it's for some of the higher risk devices, you'll need to demonstrate that on an annual basis. And you'll look at how the diagnostic is used, what kind of results you're getting, how that maps across to actual patient experience, and does that still meet the requirements for clinical evidence. And you need to demonstrate that on a regular basis, particularly for the high risk devices. Just looking at clinical benefit. Clinical benefit for medical devices and IVDs is similar but different. If you think of a medical device being a hip implant, or a contact lens, or a heart valve, or a blood pressure machine, blood pressure monitor, the benefit is slightly different because you can actually measure that in patient-related outcomes. For an IVD, for a diagnostic device, I think it's difficult to measure benefit because it's around the function of the device. Is it meant for screening? Is it meant for monitoring? Is it meant for diagnosis, prognosis? All the kinds of different things you can do once you've got some information about a patient from a sample. The clinical benefit there is more complex to measure. And in the middle there, you can see where I've lent Camilla this slide and I've left a gap there because I don't know what it is, but maybe Krish and Munira and Sheila, the people who understand medicines can kind of explain the clinical benefit of a medicine. It's different to a medical device, different to a diagnostic device. So we need to make sure that the diagnostic device, the risk-benefit ratio is positive, that actually offers more benefit than risk. Not that it's without risk, but the clinical benefit ratio, the benefit-risk ratio is positive. So when we talk about clinical performance, we talk about clinical evidence. We talk about three different things mentioned in the regulation, the three pillars, and most of the notified bodies, most of the competent authorities will talk about this in terms of clinical evidence. Scientific validity, analytical performance, and clinical performance. Start in the middle there, analytical performance, the ability of the device to correctly detect or measure the analyte biomarker, the thing that you're measuring. So can it measure? Can it find the thing you're meant to find? And I think that's pretty basic. Most people can do that. And that's a laboratory-based study. Moving over to that left-hand side, scientific validity, the association of the analyte to the clinical condition. bit more complex. I'm going to build on these in a moment, so I'll explain them in more detail. And then over on the right-hand side, there's a lot of words, but to summarise that, it's the ability of the device to yield results correlated with a clinical condition. So there you go. What is the evidence for the association between the biomarker and the clinical outcome? How good is the IVD at detecting the biomarker? And how good is the IVD at providing information correlated with the patient's clinical condition? Now, what is the clinical condition that you're looking to measure? These are the terms that the IVD regulation uses to describe scientific validity, analytical performance, and clinical performance. If you look at scientific validity, that over on that left-hand side, most of that you can do on your laptop. Yeah, I'm guessing most of that you can do within a library and looking at published literature. Apart from obviously that bottom one, results from clinical performance studies. Analytical performance, as I say, most of that most people are familiar. Most people working in a laboratory or manufacturing products will be very familiar with, and that's kind of what you could do in a lab. Over on that right-hand side, that clinical performance depends on the patient. It depends on the prevalence of disease in your test population. So most of that will need to come from a clinic. So you'll be doing a scientific validity study, you're doing an analytical performance study, you'll be doing a clinical performance study, very different types of study. Do you need to do a study? Well, yes. The regulations say the manufacturer shall demonstrate the scientific validity. And those of you who are used to working with regulations and standards know that shall is a very emphatic word. It means it needs to get done. Yeah, it needs to get done. Analytical performance, as a general, the analytical performance shall be demonstrated on the basis of analytical performance studies. So you need to get the analytical performance, and you need to base it on performance studies. And then clinical performance, again, clinical performance studies shall be performed unless there's a justification not to. And that may be because you can rely on other sources of clinical performance. So we need to have a think about what equivalence means there. Can you look at an equivalent device already available? Demonstrate clinical performance, we mentioned it being a life cycle throughout the life cycle of the product. You start with the manufacturer of the device will need to start with a performance evaluation plan. What am I going to do to get the data that I need to get a CE mark? What am I going to present to the notified body to say this is okay for us to place this product on the market? Do all those studies and then write up a performance evaluation report. There will be a format for a performance evaluation report which sets out exactly what evidence is required in the format that is required by the regulations. The regulations become much more prescriptive. And then there'll be a format and a mechanism for getting post-market performance follow-up. So getting that clinical evidence throughout the life cycle of the device. Can't remember what this one was about. Oh, I know. Sorry. If you're going to be doing a performance study of a medical device, Chapter 6 is what you need to look at in the regulations, and that will tell you about for any device. Genetic device, non-genetic, any diagnostic device, whether it's a genetic test or a biochemistry test or a microbiology test, there are some general requirements which you need to comply with. For some tests, there are some additional requirements, and I'll talk to you about those in a moment. But you need to get informed consent from your patient. You'll need to think about studies involving very specific groups. I'll talk to you about those in a moment. Damage compensation for if you're involved in a clinical trial and it doesn't go quite to plan, and how all of those studies are assessed. These are all set out in the regulations in quite some detail. They're quite comprehensive, much more comprehensive than we have at the moment. We have the concept of a performance evaluation study where there's kind of a one page in the directives. In the regulations, the new regulations, there are multiple pages and multiple requirements, very prescriptive. And there is going to be an ISO standard which we hope will be harmonised to the IVDR in time, which is clinical performance studies. Okay, So these are the general requirements that all studies will need. Whether you're doing a performance study for a biochemistry test or a genetic test or a microbiology test, this is pretty much apple pie stuff for most manufacturers of IVDs, for most labs who are developing their own diagnostic test. There's nothing new about this. The thing which I would want to highlight is that last point, the data generated by the study. The study protocol needs to set out that the data are reliable and robust right from the very outset. The additional requirements are for these particular types of study. So we talk about companion diagnostics, but also if it's an interventional study, if you're managing the patient based on the results from that device under development, if it's a surgically invasive sample, if there's any additional risk to the patient, to the subject, then there's an additional requirement. And that additional requirement would be like this. Again, most of this is kind of apple pie stuff. It's fairly simple and straightforward for most manufacturers now. What the regulations do is they set it out much more clearly and more prescriptively. The thing which is different is that one, prior authorization by a member state, which means that anybody wanting to run an interventional performance study or a study giving more risks to the patient or a companion diagnostic study will need to come to, in the UK, MHRA, saying, please, can we do our study? We will assess that application and decide whether or not they can start with the study. And that's the process we will follow. I'm not going to go through all of that. Munir will be pleased to hear we'll stick to time. But there is quite a comprehensive route for getting that assessment made. This is my interpretation of the regulations. I know there are mistakes in it. You can tell me what those mistakes are when you've read the regulations. But if you find them, I am keen to hear about them. The couple of things I want to point out is there's a coordination element. Member states will need to coordinate with each other, so people can run multi-state clinical performance studies of IVDs. And at the end, there are mechanisms for how that performance study will be published. So that the report will need to be published. This is around companion diagnostics. Not so much around pharmacogenomics per se, but around companion diagnostics. And this is just to say that yes, there is a route for regulation of medicines. Yes, we now have a new route for regulations of the diagnostic, and those routes run parallel. And we will be looking at how we can make sure that they are coordinated so that when you have a drug which is dependent on diagnostic, we have a diagnostic which is essential for the drug, that those are coordinated together and that they're available to patients. Hopefully near enough the same time. Oh, any questions? There we go. Thank you very much.